Nintendo's stock price has been dropping to one of its lowest points in almost a year as Switch 2 sales continue to slow down. From barely any exclusive games to ridiculous price hikes, the Switch 2's failure has been in store for Nintendo all along, and they're finally experiencing what they had coming. So in this video, I'm going to dive into all of the details of the Nintendo stock crash and what the company did for this to happen. Let's get started. First, I want to dive into the progression of the stock dropping and when things happened because it's pretty interesting and helps explain what exactly is going on. Now, if you've been following Nintendo's stock, it's been pretty high compared to what it's been in previous years, ever since January 16th, 2025, the day that the Switch 2 was announced. And up until this stock crash that I'm about to get into in a moment, the stock price has remained pretty high ever since then. The only time that there's been a significant dip between January 16th and the stock crash was on April 2nd, and that was because after the Switch 2 Direct, the $80 price backlash for Mario Kart World was kind of a big deal for that one Nintendo Treehouse stream where people were spamming drop the price. And that alone is a pretty big deal for the share price because it's pretty hard for the public to scare investors into selling their stock unless the outrage is truly unified, which it was in this case. But that was really the only time that the stock actually dipped, and it rebounded after that, reaching an all-time high in August. But Nintendo didn't keep that momentum for too long because the stock price kept wavering up until around December 1st when everything came crashing down for Nintendo, and it came crashing down for around 2 weeks. And in total, the stock price lost around 25% of its value. And this crash is something that Nintendo's actions have all been pointing to for quite a while, so let's get into all of the reasons why it's happening. The most obvious reason why Nintendo's stock is failing is due to consumer backlash. That stock drop that I mentioned after the Switch 2 Direct, it didn't happen for no reason. The Switch 2 hardware, games, accessories, they're all more expensive than the Switch 1's lineup. And it definitely didn't help when Nintendo raised prices due to tariffs and stalled pre-orders for about 2.5 weeks. And in addition to perceived greed, Nintendo also went full anti-consumer mode this time around, aiming not for just greed, but also for control. Because Nintendo also added a clause to their end-user license agreement, essentially allowing themselves to remotely disable your Switch 2, or brick it as people say, if you decide to mod your Switch 2 under certain circumstances. Nintendo also rolled out game keycards, which, if you don't already know, they basically download the game off the internet even though you have a physical card that is the license, so the game file isn't actually on the game card like most games. Now, game keycards were originally set aside for third parties to use to save money, but Nintendo has broken that trend because one of Nintendo's upcoming games, Pokemon Pokopia, has been confirmed to be on a game keycard if you buy the physical version. These two pretty anti-consumer practices have made fans and everyone else pretty mad at Nintendo, and the vocal opinions about these decisions are likely making investors pretty nervous too. One reason that explains why this stock crash is this big. But it's not just that, because another major reason why Nintendo's stock price is failing is because they've forgotten who their fanbase even is. Now, despite the fact that Nintendo is heavily shifting their business philosophy to prioritize control through anti-consumer practices, a lot of Nintendo fans don't even care about that because they can't even get over the price of the Switch 2. And I'm not even talking about the prices of the games like $80 for Mario Kart or $100 for Joy-Con 2 controllers. I'm talking about the $450 price tag of the base Switch 2 hardware. As I mentioned in one of my previous videos, link in the description, Nintendo's core business model has always been to be the more affordable option for consumers. But because Nintendo prioritized powerful hardware this time around, That costs more money to produce, and as a result, the Switch 2 is the first mainline Nintendo console to be over $300, and with the Switch 2, Nintendo broke this $300 price point in flying colors. Because the Switch 2 is $150 more than that, which is half of the $300 price point that people are so used to paying. My point is that there are quite a few Nintendo fans who just bought Nintendo consoles, not because they were their favorite, but because they were the cheapest available. I mean, $200 for a Switch Lite, $80 for a 2DS near the end of its life, which had a free game with it, and the Wii Mini being only $99 were some of the greatest Nintendo deals ever, and a major reason why they sold so many consoles. And these aren't the only examples, because the introductory price of many Nintendo consoles were generally significantly cheaper than competitors. But because the Switch 2 made such a massive leap in price, there are some Nintendo fans who simply will not buy it just because it's too expensive to get into the ecosystem. After all, the Switch still is a good console that Nintendo is supporting, and the games are not nearly as expensive. But let's talk about another unexpected reason why Nintendo's stock price is dropping so much. A significant factor of the Switch 2's launch was pretty different from any other Nintendo console launch ever. Nintendo made enough units. And about a week after this console launched, Nintendo sort of bragged about how well it was doing. They made a post in their socials stating that the Switch 2 had sold 3.5 million units in its first week of being available. And at the time, this was kind of interesting because nobody expected the Switch 2 to do this well. After all, the high prices, the boycotts, the negative press, and everything in between, it wouldn't make sense for this console to sell this well. But it actually makes sense if Nintendo made enough consoles. Because generally, when a new system launches, there's not enough stock for all the fans who want to get their hands on one, so they wait until a restock, which makes any sales numbers be lower than they would be if there were enough systems. But because Nintendo satisfied demand, it was the fastest selling console in the first week. This essentially made the Switch 2 look like it was doing better than normal because Nintendo was shipping units faster even though demand was basically the same. And it's pretty likely that this is the case because the Switch 2 reportedly sold less than the PS5 in the United States for the month of November, which would make no sense otherwise because the PS5 is 5 years old. And this makes investors nervous because they don't know what to expect. But every reason why the stock price is dropping so hard is a result of the actual drop, not the reason it started. So with that, let's dive into the main reason that Nintendo's stock price has dropped so much. Now, the reason that Nintendo's stock started to drop so hard is actually because of an external crisis, and that is the RAM crisis. As you probably know, as it's been covered everywhere in the tech industry, RAM prices have been skyrocketing as AI data centers are trying to aggressively purchase it. And if you're not somebody who knows basic technology, RAM is basically special storage that the device uses temporarily to store data that it's currently using, separate from long-term storage. And the RAM crisis is just a bigger trigger of other problems that Nintendo has been having, because if they raise the price of the Switch 2 because of the RAM crisis, they're going to get a ton of backlash from fans like they've been getting for every other reason. But if Nintendo pays for the RAM and doesn't increase the prices, that also causes problems for investors because they're less profitable. And all of these other concerns that I mentioned of Nintendo's current status just make this crash even worse than what it would be without those issues. And with this crisis continuing on, Nintendo's stock price likely will not go up for a long time. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this, I would appreciate if you would like this video and subscribe, and if you're watching within the first 7 days, make sure to hype this video. But anyway, thanks for watching and have a great day.